Welcome back to the First Gnostic Church of Christ. We are on video number 2, the Discourse on the 8th and 9th. We left off in our last video where the student and the teacher were discussing about the 8th and 9th realms. And in this case, we ended up, the teacher encourages the student to think for itself, to look for its own truth, to go within, and to count itself as a sibling with many other brothers and sisters of the world that have come to understand the truth lies within themselves. And that's where we left off, where then the student responds about the comment the teacher had made when he had said, "Child, when you understand the truth of your statement, you will find your siblings who are my children praying with you." That is, the student describes, "I understand nothing else than the beauty I've experienced in the books." Before we read and comment, I'm going to address a couple of questions that were presented in the comment section of the first video of the Discourse on the 8th and 9th. But I'm going to go to the second one first as response. I'm going to give is a lot more straightforward than the second one. The first comes from Kalamala. He or she says, "Thank you. One person's anomaly is another's rebellion." And she's referring, of course, to Sophia's anomaly, and that the nature of Gnostics is to be rebellious. I imagine the fundamental quote-unquote no didn't exist before Sophia's desire to understand the Father. And in our last video, if you had listened to that video, we come to speculate Gnosis and Nois both stem from a similar understanding of the word no, that we as Gnostics bring to existence a contrary, a something different than ever has existed before. A kind of no is a way of experiencing authenticity or authoring something unique, as opposed to agreeing with what already exists, which then talks about Yahweh or Yah or yes, which is those things that are established. And this is what I had picked up through inspiration, reading the Gnostic text and the canonical text. So this is what Kalamala is referring to. She's speculating that no didn't exist before Sophia's desire to understand the Father. Kalamala goes on to say, "I suppose the important question presented to us," he or she is not necessarily addressing this to me or just musing out loud and commenting, but I thought it was worthwhile to read this comment, as there's a lot of good here worth sharing. "Is it our purpose to know the Father, or is it our purpose to understand the Father?" The funny thing about understanding something, wisdom, as opposed to knowing something, logic, is you have to be equal or greater to the thing in order to understand it. And therein lies the issue or potential for an anomaly. Nicely put. Now, whether our purpose is to get to know the Father or to understand the Father, I would argue it's likely both, but I would say through Sophia, it's understanding, and through the Christ, it's through gnosis, and that's a kind of knowing. But it's interesting, they are consorts. Christ represents the gnosis, because he brings along the nous, the mind, and gnosis, this is the know. And interestingly, it's Sophia that would be representing the yes, as she is the one responsible for Yahweh, or the demiurge. However, having said that, that is in this realm. But from the standpoint of the pleroma, it's opposite to that. In the spiritual sense, Sophia was the one that brought about the anomalies. So that would be the first presentation of the concept of a no, as you are presenting here. So, very astute. And then you go on to say, respectfully, would the Gnostic fathers and mothers of the past take issue with gnosis being associated with a concept and normal definition of church? Or would their rebellious nature lead them to not agree? I suspect they would lean towards a term, more likely society or family. Question. I agree with you. I think even when I opened up this specific channel, I was very leery about using the term, First Gnostic Church of Christ, as opposed to some other term. However, I chose that term, church, primarily to Gnosticism really borrows from many different offshoots. In particular, we're talking about Hermeticism, Buddhism, Mandeism, etc., etc. But even beyond that, most central to Gnosticism is Judaism. So they use that term very much, especially Christianity, whereas, of course, the Muslims would use something different. Jewish would use something like a synagogue, for example. But that term church was purposely used for this channel to inspire people to come to this channel, specifically from those looking for a body similar to a church. Because often we see on the YouTube channels, Gnosticism is just really narrowed down to conspiracy theories or misinterpreted to be New Age thought or mysticism, perhaps Luciferianism or Satanism, when it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. The central figure of Gnosticism, at least shared with Christianity, is Christ. And of course, we also have the equally central figure of Sophia in Gnosticism, whereas that's not present in Christianity. They have something somewhat similar, although it's at a diminished comparative level to Christ, in the feminine role, which is, of course, Mary or Eve. I would agree with you. Really, probably church is not a term that would best describe the way that Gnostics would appreciate coming together. But having said that, very briefly, that is in the historical sense of that word church, that originates from the Old English chiriche, or circa, so I'll probably ruin how I pronounce these, derived from the Proto-Germanic kirika, karika maybe, which in turn likely came from the Greek kuriakon, meaning belonging to the Lord. And of course, Gnostics, we don't believe we belong to anybody. There is no belonging. We aren't possessed. We are not the father and mother's possession. And of course, Orthodox Christianity would likely think something different. And so then using the term church would likely be much more in alignment with the way they understand their relationship to God. Thank you for sharing that. As I said, just really enjoy your comments because they're very, very thoughtful. And I like the way you kind of muse out loud through your commenting. So thank you, Kalamala. And then we're going to go back to the first comment, and this is going to be a little more extensive because I think it's very important to address this particular question, particularly because there is a preconception about a particular book that was written right around 1908, 1909 called Kybalion. Many people mistaken that to be a Hermetic book, which in fact it is not. However, having said that, here Truth Seeking 9901 asks, what about keeping the precepts? Unless I'm misunderstanding you, not certain if you're referring to Gnosticism or are you referring to Hermeticism, because we talked about both in that video. But I'm going to presume that you're talking about Hermeticism, because Gnostics don't have a particular set of precepts per se, but oftentimes among Hermeticists, at least modern day Hermeticists, they would consider Kybalion to be the book that describes the 7 Hermetic principles. And so let's first start with understanding, and I'm not saying you don't understand this already. Kybalion, A Study of Hermetic Philosophy, Ancient Egypt and Greece, is a book originally published in 1908 by 3 initiates, and they were among the New Thought movement of that time. And they purport to convey the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. While it shares with ancient and medieval Hermetic texts a number of traits such as philosophical mentalism, the concept of as above, so below, and the idea that everything consists of gendered polar opposites, as a whole, it is more indebted to the ideas of modern occultist authors, especially those of New Thought movement, to which Atkinson belonged and who wrote this book. A modern Hermetic tract, it has been widely influential in New Age circles since the 20th century. And it goes into the 7 Hermetic principles, and we're going to address that here in a moment because this write-up doesn't really clarify what it means by each of these principles. This is important, I think, still to understand because for a couple of reasons. One, particularly being a Gnostic, it's going to be important and often that you will run into Hermeticism, right? Know and run into Hermeticists because we share so much in common with what they understand about the universe and God. So it's important for us to understand those 7 Hermetic principles, and then you can take from that whatever you like. Going down a little further, it says, according to the writer Mitchell Horowitz, the philosophical mentalism described by Kybalion's first principles is inspired by broadly similar notions of the ancient Greek Hermetica. And it goes on to describe, there's probably about 3 or 4 principles in that particular book that really are directly taken from Hermeticism. The rest are really kind of stretching it, we can say, or a very generalized interpretation of some of the terms and ideas found in the Emerald Tablets, which is purportedly written by either Thoth and or Hermes, some of the other books that were supposedly penned by Hermes. The 7 Hermetic principles, as outlined in the Kybalion, are not from Hermes, is the point I'm making. However, they're supposed to be interpretations from Hermetic teachings or understandings, at least from the writer of that particular book, Kybalion. That's important to understand. But even having said that, there are, even in the Emerald Tablets and some of the other books, these concepts and ideas or these principles, albeit, sort of interpreted or translated through this guy, William Walker Atkinson. So it's still important for us to, I think, understand these principles. So let's go to that. But I also want to outline the terms Hermeticism versus Hermetism, often used interchangeably. Hermetism refers to a specific, narrower philosophical and religious tradition centered around the corpus hermeticum and Asclepius, while Hermeticism encompasses a broader range of ideas and practices inspired by Hermetic tradition that also expands to include alchemy, astrology, and theurgy. You're going to hear those terms often used interchangeably, and loosely we could say they can be fairly used interchangeably. However, if we wanted to be exact, we see that these two terms mean something somewhat differently. Hermetism really is the original teaching of Hermes, and then all those teachings then spawned practices delving into other arts or metaphysical arts like alchemy, astrology, and theurgy. And so Hermetism eventually expanded into Hermeticism. And Hermetism really is at the root. Really, there aren't that many, if any, true Hermetists anymore. People pretty much have evolved into Hermeticists. Having clarified that, let's go on to the next tab here. We're going to briefly read through these 7 principles, known as the Hermetic Precepts or principles. It refers to the 7 fundamental principles of Hermeticism, a philosophical and spiritual tradition which include mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read through here, and then I'm going to comment about my understanding of the way in which your general Gnostic might understand that principle. So let's start here. The principle of mentalism. Quote, the all is mind, the universe is mental, meaning that the universe is a mental creation and everything is ultimately a manifestation of thought. And we would agree with this principle as a Gnostic pretty wholeheartedly, although we would go even a step further. And even though Hermeticists do mention this, they only mention it very briefly. But for Gnostics, it is even more of a core feature than is mentalism. And that is even, we would argue, is at the root of mentalism, which is logos. And logos, it does then spawn logic, but logos in its highest form, at least from the pleroma, in the perspective of Gnostics, would be termed the word, is the source of all mentalism. It comes from the original thought of the monad, but then transforms into spoken word that then brings about the creation. Now that spoken word isn't necessarily through the mouth, it can also be mental. So we can argue over whether or not there really is a difference. That's why I said we pretty much would likely, at least in a very general understanding of that term mentalism, Gnostics would agree with that first principle. Now going to the next one, the principle of correspondence. Quote, as above, so below. As below, so above. Meaning there is a correspondence between the microcosm, the individual, and the macrocosm, the universe. Now Gnostics would agree with this in that there is what's called the emanation that then projects itself into this realm. So everything in this realm is really a reflection of the true form and the pleroma. And the pleroma would represent the microcosm, whereas this realm, the kanoma, would represent the microcosm. Now, of course, I know that it's not necessarily suggesting it in that sense. When we think about the Fibonacci, what is it called? The spiral, can't think of it right now, but it's that everything is just if you go at the lowest level, the cell looks like a universe, so forth and so on, and the universe looks like a cell, that everything is really just a reflection of from the smallest to the largest and from the inner to the outward. So we would agree with that principle, whether we think of it from the standpoint of height, dimension, or outward versus inward. So the next principle, the principle of vibration, quote, nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates, meaning that everything in the universe is in a state of constant motion and vibration. Now here's where we might argue as a Gnostic, we agree on one hand, but not necessarily on the other hand. Because in Gnosticism, we recognize this understanding of the not. And the not is something that does not vibrate. It is everything that is the opposite of that which moves and vibrates. So this realm is, scientists might call it dark matter, for example, but even then that's not truly the best term. There really isn't a term other than that which is not. And that which is not doesn't vibrate, nor does it move, nor would we necessarily say it's at rest. What we would say, though, in this universe, depending on if you mean it in a motive sense or you mean it in a, I guess, physics sense, an actual movement sense, like in a practical way, then obviously people rest. But if you're thinking in terms of that energy is everywhere and there is nowhere in the universe where there's not energy that's vibrating, then this would be true. But if you're thinking about it in the way Gnostics describe being in motion versus being at rest, this is more in a qualitative way, the way that we are conducting ourselves, or the way that our mind may be at rest, meaning at peace, versus active, or being engaged in something versus being called out towards some other engagement. So again, it's just all a matter of how you want to interpret that particular principle, but for the most part we would agree with the principle of vibration. Okay, the principle of polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree, meaning that everything has a dual nature with opposing poles or aspects. Now, in the modern world, we would use the term continuum. Everything is a continuum. Cold is just on the opposite end of the continuum of hot. And we don't know that there's really ever a end to how hot or cold something can get. However, scientists would argue there is the Kelvin degree or temperature, the coldest negative 274, I think it is, Kelvin. Although that's what we know of today, and even that is just a theory that can't be necessarily proven. At least through mathematics, they've come close to maybe understanding, but otherwise not in actual observation. When we think about duality in this realm, that we would agree with that. When they say everything, where Gnostics would agree everything in this realm is dual. Everything in this realm has opposites, and those opposites create the perfect mind, or the thunder. Where we would disagree is in the pleroma. Everything is synergistic. They are consorts or agreeable. So they are not polar to one another, but they're complementary. There is no friction. They aren't dual to each other. They're one body. It's very hard to understand because we live in the realm of polarity and opposites. But in the pleroma, there are no opposites. Everything simply is an essence of consorting. So Christ and Sophia is an example of that, and they are androgynous. And we're not talking about genitalia here. We're talking about their traits. They are a body, one body. They work together. They're synergistic. They're synergistic. So the way Gnostic would describe this is they are not opposite to each other, and they are not polar to each other. But in the realm of the Kenoma, we would agree with the principle of polarity. Going to the next principle, the principle of rhythm. Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything, meaning that everything in the universe follows a rhythmic pattern of ebb and flow. So we're thinking about the sine wave, right? We've got the trough, the peak, and then the in-between, the upslope, the downslope. In this case, Gnostics would say, in this realm, we can cultivate gnosis and wisdom. And by so doing, we then begin to understand rhythms. We begin to gain a kind of foresight, an ability to tune in to truth. Not only our authentic truth, but the way the universe works. And this is something Sophia is encouraging us to do. And that's what wisdom is all about, engaging in wickedness. And if you're Gnostic, you understand what I'm saying. I'm not talking about engaging in foul play and meanness and ugliness and hurting people, but we're talking about engaging in the wisdom of this realm for a reason. Now, and that is to gain knowledge. to engage and partake of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the most healthy and beneficial way to grow from that, taking from that tree, is to balance those right and left sides, and then bring about your emanation or creation, to focus on your creation, not try to create or emanate for others, but for yourself. That is what rhythm is all about for a Gnostic. So we would agree with this, but not necessarily for the same reason that perhaps Hermeticists would agree with it. They might think of it in a much more metaphysical way, whereas we might think about it in a much more practical sense about growing in gnosis and wisdom. Now, having said that, as a Gnostic, we would agree with this principle in a much more scientific way, understanding frequency in the universe, and everything is ebb and flow. All right, now let's move to the next one, the principle of cause and effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law, meaning that everything has a cause and effect, and that everything happens according to natural law. It's been often argued that Hermetics were the first true scientists, and they did all kinds of studies with trying to turn lead into gold and the alchemy, really. And that was born many of the first, at least in the Western world. And we're thinking about the East or China, and they have their own documentation, scientists thousands of years ago, so forth and so on. But at least from the Western perspective, in ancient Greece, you had your first documentation of mathematics, and which really comes from the word, or stems from the word magician or magic. And this is something that people don't realize, but it stems from that word ma, which means mirage, or the mother aspect. But anyway, getting back to the principle of cause and effect. So this one really is metaphysical, but also scientific, is really what this is talking about. But when we think about it as a Gnostic, although we appreciate the metaphysical or the scientific aspect of this principle, we then also apply it to a spiritual understanding, and we would call that the law of karma. We would say that it makes no sense that everything, this is the law of thermodynamics and Newton's perspective. From a Gnostic perspective, it's not logical to understand and experience that everything has a push and pull, and as Newton would say, everything has thermodynamics, really, and then not apply that to human nature. Why? Occam's razor would suggest that the simplest thing would be to apply it to everything, because there's nothing to suggest otherwise. So we would apply it to karma. So we were thinking about the dialogue, the last book that we had read and commented about. We invited the understanding that morality is not necessary for a functional, thriving society where people are doing quote-unquote good things to each other because of the law of karma, because everything that we do is going to come back to us. I have a saying, it goes, everything you do will come back to you. Everything you say will come your way. And this is what we consider the principle of cause and effect in a spiritual way. All right, so the next principle, the principle of gender. Both masculine and feminine qualities exist in everything, meaning that everything has both masculine and feminine aspects which are in a state of balance. Now, of course, nothing is in this universe is continually in a state of balance. It's either in a state of balance or phasing out, looking for a different state of balance. This principle talks really about transformation, because the way it's written here, at least, it would suggest there is no transformation. Everything's always in a state of balance. Well, this is, at least Gnostic would not agree with that. But we definitely would agree with everything is made up of a quality of the feminine and the masculine. And when we realize that, and we try to balance those two as best as we can, then have the highest potential for the perfect mind. Now, in the pleroma, you have the perfect amalgamation of that principle, gender, which we talked about, the consorts, that they are androgynous. And that is the highest form of human, where we will eventually ascend to androgyny. I'm not necessarily talking about physical androgyny, I'm talking about spiritual androgyny. The way we think about gender will really disappear. And that's why you're seeing struggles about whether you're on this side of that argument or that side of this argument, we're talking about in a spiritual sense. But it's coming up through the body, because this is something, as we evolve, will become more and more front and center a topic, because it's so central to human evolution, not only in a physical sense, but in a story-oriented and spiritual sense. So that is the 7, at least what was generated by AI, precepts of Hermeticism, or Hermetic precepts, also called the Seven Principles, at least according to Kybalion, written from 1908. And they then say that they got this by inspiration of the Hermetic principles in general. Take from that what you will, but this exercise, I think, is very beneficial for us as Gnostics so that we can appreciate the nuances of how we might have some differences between Hermetics and Hermetics view metaphysical concepts and terms or principles versus how Gnostic might view it. And you can see that it's not that different. Now, having said all of that, let's move on and read a little bit, and we'll read just maybe about 5-10 minutes of this since we're likely 25 minutes in. In this case, we think the teacher is likely Hermes. It says, "Child, when you understand the truth of your statement, you will find your siblings, who are my children, praying with you." And when he says that, he's talking about when you realize the most authentic truth doesn't come from outside yourself. It comes from within you. The outside world inspires you to get closer and closer to that truth, as the monad has emanated signs and symbols into the universe for you, quietly, silently, to help guide you to that truth, the Christ within, the hope of glory. What's interesting is that when we think about as above, so below, and below above, we're thinking about a reflection really is looking at yourself in a mirror. So when you're looking on the left, you're seeing your left side, and then when you look on the right, you're seeing your right side. But what's interesting is our back is facing opposite to each other. Does that make sense? So the person behind the mirror back is facing front to you, whereas your back is facing behind you. But yet still, the paradox is their left side that you're seeing is also your left side, and vice versa. The right side is their right side in the mirror. And so that's what's very interesting. The mirror really is a reflection of, we can think of it as symbolic of the realm of the pleroma versus the kenoma. This is that realm emanating into this realm is what is guiding us, providing us signs and symbols that then help us to reflect on the inner self. The child then says, or the student says, the apprentice says, "Father, I understand nothing else than the beauty I have experienced in the books." And he goes on and says, "This is what you call the beauty of the soul, the edification you have experienced in stages. May the understanding come to you, and you will teach." And so the goal here is we are students for a time, but eventually, as we ascend in our teaching, our understandings, we then become the teacher. And the child says, "I have understood, Father, each of the books, and especially ... Now, we don't know what he's saying here. Child ... in praises from those who raised them. "Father, I shall receive from you the power of the discourse you will utter. As it was spoken to the two of us, let us pray, Father." And so now he's recognizing everybody outside of us is presenting a discourse to you. And that then presents something opposite to you. And that opposite then creates a potential for power. And then we all use that power. Some people share that power, other people greedily hoard it for themselves. And that's how we then energize ourselves. And then we also begin to reflect on particular engagement that we've had. And so this is where he says, "Father, I shall receive from you the power of the discourse you will utter." So now he's literally not looking for answers, but instead he's looking for the synergy between the teacher himself as a student. And that's exactly where Hermes wants him, because that is the highest form that you want to be in when you are engaging with others. You're not looking at yourself as subordinate to them, but you're looking to them as an opportunity to grow, and vice versa. They too can look at you as an opportunity to grow. And so, "As it was spoken to the two of us, let us pray, Father." And then he says, "Child, it is fitting for us to pray to God with all our mind and all our heart and all our soul, and to ask God that the gift of the eighth reach us, and that each receive from God what belongs to God." Now this is interesting. The eighth reaching us versus, God just tell us, right? Tell us the answers. What does that mean? It's a gift, right? The eighth realm reach us. Meaning, in other words, that we are able to have an understanding from within. Like it touches us, in other words. We get that we are able to transcend at that level. Because when we are living in the lower form of behaving or thinking or existing, then we're not able to reach the eighth realm. And the eighth realm, therefore, is not going to reach out to us, because in the eighth realm, it only makes sense for it to invite those that are ready for that level of being, because otherwise it would disrupt that higher state, you see. And that each reach from God what belongs to God. So remember that the Christ within, the hope of glory, Christ is God, Christ is within you, Christ is part of you, and therefore you too, having not said, ye also are God's. That you receive what rightfully belongs to you is what's being said here. Your job is to understand. Mine is to be able to utter the discourse from the spring that flows to me. And why is he using spring? Because spring is where potential is, you see. So we talked about that before. The power is what matters. The engagement between the two parties. Not this idea of hierarchy, that I'm superior and you're subordinate to me. But you are an apprentice. You're not subordinate. I'm a teacher. You're a student. They're neither worse or better. You too someday will be a teacher. They're different periods or times of our life, different parts of our growth through life. All right, we're going to stop it there, because then it goes into the prayer for the ascent to the 8th and 9th. And I think that's a great place to start in our next video. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, have a blessed day.